At 2:20 p.m. on September 15, 1942, the USS Wasp should have survived. 3 torpedo impacts from AA-19 were devastating, yes, but not fatal for a fleet carrier designed to absorb punishment. Yet, within hours, the Wasp was a blazing inferno, abandoned by her crew. The real killer was not Japanese torpedoes. It was something far more insidious, something that turned the carrier's own systems against her. The wreck, discovered 76 years later in the Coral Sea, tells a different story than the official records. The evidence is unmistakable, carved into twisted steel at the bottom of the ocean. What design flaw doomed the Wasp before the first torpedo even struck? The answer lies in the Wasp's aviation fuel system, a fatal design compromise that would prove catastrophic under combat conditions. Unlike her sister ships in the Yorktown class, the USS Wasp carried approximately 178,000 gallons of highly volatile aviation gasoline in inadequately protected tanks directly beneath her hangar deck. These tanks lacked the extensive compartmentalization and sophisticated fire suppression systems found in later carrier designs. When Japanese submarine WWII fired its spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes that afternoon, it was not just attacking a warship. It was unknowingly triggering a catastrophic chain reaction in a vessel already compromised by its own architecture. The first torpedo struck near the forward aviation fuel tanks, where thin bulkheads offered minimal protection against explosive force. Within seconds, the second torpedo hit amidships, breaching additional fuel compartments. The third impact completed what naval engineers would later call the perfect storm of fuel system vulnerability. This was not simply bad luck. It was the inevitable result of design choices made years earlier when the Washington Naval Treaty forced compromises in the Wasp's construction. With displacement limited to 14,700 tons, significantly lighter than her sisters Yorktown and Enterprise, naval architects sacrificed protection for capacity. The decision to consolidate aviation fuel storage without adequate armor or separation became the carrier's death sentence. The wreckage, discovered in 2019 by the research vessel Petrel, tells the story through twisted metal and blown-out bulkheads. High-definition underwater imagery revealed catastrophic internal damage extending far beyond the torpedo impact sites, evidence of massive secondary explosions that propagated through interconnected fuel handling systems. The very infrastructure designed to deliver fuel to the Wasp's aircraft became the conduit for her destruction. For decades, the official narrative emphasized Japanese torpedoes, but the truth was more complex. The Wasp was not just hit. She was fundamentally compromised by her own anatomy. By August 1942, the USS Wasp had already survived months of intense combat operations. Commissioned just before America's entry into World War II, she quickly found herself thrust into the desperate struggle for control of the Pacific. The carrier's schedule had become increasingly grueling as the Guadalcanal campaign intensified, with constant flight operations pushing both crew and machinery to their limits. Earlier that summer, the Wasp had participated in Operation Pedestal, the desperate Malta convoy run through the Mediterranean where she faced repeated Axis air attacks. Despite close calls, she survived, her crew gaining confidence in their ship with each successful mission. This combat experience came at a cost, however, as continuous operations left little time for thorough maintenance and equipment inspections. By early September, intelligence reports indicated increased Japanese submarine activity throughout the Solomon Islands as Imperial forces sought to isolate and recapture Guadalcanal. American carrier groups were prime targets, with Japanese submarine commanders specifically hunting for the predictable patterns of flight operations. Captain Forrest Sherman, commanding the Wasp, was a skilled and experienced officer who understood these risks. Yet the operational demands of supporting Marine forces ashore left little room for evasive maneuvering. Each day, the carrier had to maintain station within her assigned operating area, launching and recovering aircraft on a schedule that became increasingly predictable to enemy forces. Naval records indicate that on September 14th, just one day before the attack, 3 separate intelligence reports warned of Japanese submarine activity along the carrier group's projected course. These warnings prompted increased anti-submarine patrols, but did not fundamentally alter the task force's operations. The morning of September 15th began with routine flight operations. At 6:30 in the morning, the first combat air patrol launched from Wasp's flight deck. Throughout the morning, the carrier maintained a steady 16-knot speed on a predictable southeastern heading while launching and recovering aircraft. Unknown to her crew, the Japanese submarine Y-19, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shogo Takaichi, had been tracking the American task force for hours, carefully positioning for an attack. What made the Wasp particularly vulnerable that day was not just her presence in dangerous waters, it was the internal condition of her aviation fuel system. According to maintenance logs recovered after the war, the carrier had been operating with several fuel transfer pumps flagged for repair. More critically, pressure tests on cross-compartment fuel line seals had been postponed due to operational commitments. These seemingly minor maintenance deferrals created a perfect storm of conditions. When torpedoes struck, damaged fuel lines could not be properly isolated, allowing aviation gasoline, far more volatile than ship's bunker fuel, to spread between compartments. The Wasp was essentially primed for catastrophe, a vulnerability completely invisible to her crew as they went about their duties that fateful morning. At precisely 2:20 in the afternoon on September 15th, 1942, lookouts on the USS Wasp's port side spotted torpedo wakes approaching from the starboard quarter. The alarm sounded immediately, but at 14,000 tons, and while maintaining flight operations, the carrier could not maneuver quickly enough to evade. What followed was a textbook demonstration of why the Wasp's fuel system design was fatally flawed. The first torpedo struck at 2:20 and 30 seconds in the afternoon, impacting near frame 140 on the starboard side, directly adjacent to the forward aviation fuel tanks. The explosion tore through the thin protective bulkhead, instantly igniting thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline. Survivors later reported hearing not one but two distinct explosions. The torpedo detonation was immediately followed by the more catastrophic fuel vapor explosion. 7 seconds later, at 2:20 and 37 seconds in the afternoon, the second torpedo hit approximately 20 feet aft of the first. This impact breached additional fuel compartments and critically damaged the emergency fuel isolation system. According to engineering records, that system should have allowed damage control parties to contain fuel spreading between compartments. Instead, the torpedo damage rendered it inoperable, allowing burning aviation fuel to flow freely throughout the lower decks. The third torpedo struck at 2:20 and 42 seconds in the afternoon near the forward engine room. While this hit did not directly impact fuel storage, it severed power to the remaining damage control systems, including fire main pressure pumps. Without adequate water pressure, the crew's ability to fight the rapidly spreading fires was crippled from the outset. Within 2 minutes of the initial impacts, secondary explosions began as fuel vapors accumulated in confined spaces throughout the ship. Each new explosion compromised additional compartments, creating what damage control specialists call a progressive flooding scenario. In this case, it was progressive fire spread. By 2:25 p.m., just 5 minutes after the first impact, fires had reached the hangar deck where fully fueled aircraft awaited their next mission. The heat triggered ammunition cook-offs as aircraft machine gun rounds and bombs began to detonate. These explosions blew massive holes in the hangar deck, creating chimney effects that fed fresh oxygen to the fires below. Commander Herbert Duckworth, the Wasp's damage control officer, later testified that his teams encountered an impossible situation unlike anything covered in their training. The ship's aviation fuel distribution system, designed for efficiency rather than survivability, had effectively become a network of fire distribution channels, spreading flames far beyond the initial damage zones. At 2:40 p.m., the fires reached the ship's primary aviation ordnance magazine. Only the heroic efforts of the magazine crew, who flooded the space before evacuating, prevented a catastrophic explosion that would have instantly killed everyone aboard. By 3 p.m., less than 40 minutes after the attack began, Captain Sherman faced the most difficult decision in any naval officer's career. With the central portion of his ship engulfed in uncontrollable fires, temperatures in some compartments exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the list to starboard increasing by the minute, he gave the order: abandon ship. The evacuation itself revealed further evidence of the Wasp's fundamental design vulnerabilities. Unlike later carriers with multiple widely spaced evacuation routes, the Wasp's emergency egress paths were concentrated in areas now consumed by fire. Many crew members, particularly those working in engineering spaces, found their primary escape routes blocked by flames or collapsed internal structures. As the crew abandoned ship into the shark-infested waters of the Coral Sea, The carrier continued to burn, a funeral pyre visible for miles. At 9 p.m., the destroyer USS Lansdowne delivered 5 torpedo strikes to prevent the burning hulk from falling into enemy hands. The Wasp slipped beneath the waves, carrying with her the evidence of her fatal design flaw. In the aftermath of the sinking, 193 sailors lost their lives, many not from the initial torpedo hits, but from the unstoppable fires that followed. The Navy's official report, completed in December 1942, attributed the loss primarily to enemy action, with only brief mention of deficiencies in damage control capabilities. The real story, that fundamental design flaws had turned survivable damage into a catastrophic loss, remained largely unacknowledged. For the families of the 193 men lost with the Wasp, the official explanation provided little comfort. Letters preserved in naval archives reveal a common thread of questions from widows, parents, and children, all seeking to understand how one of America's most modern carriers could be lost so quickly. The standardized responses they received mentioned heroism and sacrifice, but offered no insight into the technical failures that had claimed their loved ones. Beyond the human toll, the loss of the Wasp had strategic implications. At a critical juncture in the Guadalcanal campaign, the United States Navy found itself with just one operational carrier, USS Hornet, in the South Pacific. This vulnerability forced a temporary strategic withdrawal and nearly compromised the Marine position ashore. Most concerning was the Navy's institutional response. While some internal engineering assessments acknowledged fuel system vulnerabilities, these findings were classified and largely shelved. The subsequent Essex-class carriers, already under construction when Wasp was lost, incorporated improved fuel system protections, but these changes were framed as evolutionary improvements rather than corrections of a fatal flaw. For 76 years, the wreck of USS Wasp remained undiscovered, her final moments a matter of conjecture based on survivor accounts and incomplete records. Then, on March 13, 2019, the research vessel Petrel, funded by the late Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, located the carrier's remains resting in 14,000 feet of water. High-definition ROV footage revealed a wreck that told a different story than the official records. The most striking feature was the extensive internal damage extending far beyond the torpedo impact sites. Modern forensic analysis of the wreckage showed clear evidence of massive secondary explosions that had blown outward from the aviation fuel storage areas. Dr. Robert Ballard, renowned oceanographer who reviewed the footage, noted that what they were seeing was not consistent with simple torpedo damage. The structural failures showed patterns of explosive force propagating through internal spaces, classic signs of what we now call a progressive conflagration following the initial damage. The wreck survey revealed another critical piece of evidence: the remains of the aviation fuel distribution system. Unlike later carrier designs that used heavily armored, individually isolated fuel cells, the Wasp employed a more interconnected system. Underwater archaeology clearly showed how this network had allowed the initial fires to spread rapidly throughout the ship. For naval historians and engineers, the Petrel's discovery provided vindication for theories long proposed but never confirmed. The wreckage demonstrated how seemingly minor design compromises can have catastrophic consequences under combat conditions. More importantly, the discovery offered closure for the families of those lost. Nancy Shumway, whose grandfather died aboard the Wasp, expressed what many felt. She said that for generations they wondered if he suffered, and if there was something more that could have been done. Seeing the evidence of how quickly and catastrophically those fires spread helps us understand that no one could have saved that ship once those torpedoes hit. The loss of USS Wasp fundamentally changed American carrier design philosophy. The Essex-class carriers that formed the backbone of the Pacific War effort incorporated numerous improvements directly traceable to lessons from the Wasp disaster. These included heavily armored, individually isolated aviation fuel storage cells, automated carbon dioxide flooding systems for fuel compartments, multiple redundant fuel transfer systems with emergency isolation capabilities, improved damage control training specifically addressing aviation fuel fires. Modern U.S. Navy aircraft carriers now feature some of the most sophisticated fuel handling systems ever developed. Aviation fuel is stored in armored cells surrounded by seawater-filled cofferdams that can absorb explosive force. Automated fire detection and suppression systems can respond to threats in milliseconds. Most importantly, the entire system is designed with the philosophy that damage is inevitable in combat. What matters is containing that damage. The wreck of USS Wasp now rests as a protected war grave, a silent testament to both the sacrifice of her crew and the lessons purchased at terrible cost. Naval engineers still study her case as a prime example of how seemingly reasonable design and compromises can create catastrophic vulnerabilities when systems are stressed under combat conditions. As we navigate modern military challenges, the Wasp's story reminds us that technological advantages come with hidden vulnerabilities. From cybersecurity to autonomous systems, today's military designers face similar questions of resilience versus efficiency. The twisted steel at the bottom of the Coral Sea stands as both memorial and warning, a reminder that in warfare, systems must be designed not just for optimal performance, but for survivability when everything goes wrong. If you want to dive deeper into the engineering failures that changed naval warfare forever, explore our channel. Ocean Attacks brings you the untold stories that shaped military history through technical forensics and declassified documents. Subscribe now. Join us next week when we examine how a single wiring diagram error nearly triggered a nuclear launch during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The ocean depths hold secrets that changed the world, and we are bringing them to the surface.